This is Ivy Unleashed, a Gold Ivy production. Welcome back to Ivy Unleashed. Thank you for being with us today. Brooke and I have a feeling that this episode is very needed for our audience. We have a lot of people pleasers that have been kind of asking for an episode that can help them out. And we found the perfect person to come in and talk about people pleasing, self-abandonment, boundaries, you name it. So welcome to Ivy Unleashed, Hailey Magee.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm stoked.
Oh, we're so excited. I mean, it's something that we deal with. We know a lot of women deal with, and it's so timely, just where we are in life. I think getting into the summer months are so busy. And when we say self-abandonment, when we say boundaries, it can be a little triggering for people. And Hailey, I'd love for you to start by just sharing why this work is so personal for you, why you chose to dedicate your life to helping people knock off their people-pleasing tendencies.
Well, it's so personal. Just like all, you know what I mean? Like so many of us go into this work because it's exactly what we struggle with. So that was me. I mean, I have so many memories of looking back on my life and remembering situations where I was in an interaction that didn't feel good, whether it was like with family, friends, work, out in the community. And I couldn't assert myself. I felt like there was literally some sort of barricade in my throat that was preventing simple sentences like, I can't commit to that, or no, thank you. Like they were just not in my vocabulary. And I just remember like the frustration I felt in those moments was so palpable. Like I would look around at friends and family members who could effortlessly just be like, oh no, I can't do that today. Or like, sorry, no. And I would look at them as if I was like, you guys have a superpower. Like, how do I do this? So ultimately, when I became certified as a coach and started, of course, doing my own like healing and boundary setting work, I knew the need. I don't know. I knew I had needed it. I figured there were people out there who also needed it. And it's definitely true. There are so many of us. I've worked with clients literally around the world who grapple with these patterns. So
yeah. And whenever we share one of your quotes or some of your reflective questions, we get a lot of comments too, or like, oh man, I forgot to save. Who was that again? I really like that post. And so it's definitely resonating, especially with women. And I think something to really decipher between like what people pleasing is and being kind is, right? I feel like people feel like they're being mean or they're being rude when they assert themselves. And so can you kind of talk about the difference between being kind and people pleasing?
totally, 100%. This is one of my favorite topics because it can feel like a fine line. I think generally speaking, so for like a working definition of people pleasing for us to go off of, people pleasing is the act of chronically neglecting our own needs, feelings, wants, needs, desires for the benefit of someone else. So we're kind of self-subjugating. What makes that different from kindness is that when we're being kind, we are doing it from a place of genuine desire to give. We're not necessarily hoping to get anything back. We feel like we could say yes or no, but we choose to say yes. Like we're really doing it from a place of abundance. Whereas when we're people pleasing in our interactions with other people, there's usually some sort of transactional element. We're trying to get something back. And the thing we're trying to get back might not be tangible. It might not be like, I'll buy you a coffee, so you buy me a coffee. Although I guess that could be an example, but it's much more deeper than that. Like oftentimes what we're trying to get is a sense of being liked or a sense of security in our relationships or a sense of safety, even for those of us who have had a history of maybe using people pleasing to stay safe in hostile environments. And so we can really look under and just interrogate like the origins of our actions. Like, why are we really doing this? Like, what are we afraid would happen if we didn't do this? And those answers can be really helpful for illuminating which is which.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you say is trauma. A lot of it comes back to, I'm sure, as a child, right? Not feeling safe, not feeling that sense of belonging, and even as an adult too. So would you say it does start from trauma, or where do you think this comes from? Why do we people please?
Yeah, there are a lot of origins, and trauma is a big one. So really, trauma and then the resulting fawn response where we sort of shapeshift and be extra accommodating to make sure we're literally safe emotionally and physically. There can also be like less severe origins. Like, for example, if we had parents who were, let's say they were good parents, but they couldn't mirror us emotionally. We kind of had to exist with them and their emotional experience, and they couldn't validate us. We may have learned that the way we receive love is to self-abandon and exist in others' emotions, others' experiences, things like that. And there are also, it's so important when we talk about people pleasing to talk about like societal and cultural forces. So like you said, this resonates a lot with women because in a patriarchal society, we're taught to be the accommodating, caregiving, self-abandoning ones. And aside from gender too, like really, at least in my experience, if you come from any sort of like minority group or oppressed group or group that doesn't have a voice in a culture, you kind of learn that in order to be safe and be seen in that culture, you have to self-abandon. You have to play by the rules and put yourself, and not necessarily put yourself first or be your authentic self. There are so many ways that we can develop this pattern. It's really across the board.
Yeah. And it's a learned pattern. When you really think about it, you are safe. Your needs matter. And we all know that as at a logical point, but deep down and in our subconscious. So I'm curious, how do we start unlearning this?
But I think what you just said is a great starting foundation for learning how to break the pattern. So something and you both have kind of alluded to this, but in many cases, people pleasing, this act of chronically putting others first, stems from the deeper phenomenon of self-abandonment. Because a lot of people pleasers actually tend to not tend to our own needs and wants and desires and dreams, whether other people are involved or not. Like we could be sitting at home completely alone, having no impact on other people. And because we've been taught to devalue ourselves, it might be hard for us to take care of ourselves the way we need. And so in my experience working with clients, so often the work of being more assertive in our relationships with others and taking up space with others actually has to begin by learning to value ourselves just in our relationships with ourselves. So like, how do we do that? Literally how? Tangible steps. What really helps is to almost act as if. So you could say, if I were someone who really did value themselves and want to tend to themselves, how would a person like that act? So even if you don't feel it yet, you can mimic those self-respecting actions by scheduling that long neglected doctor's appointment or doing your physical, all these are health related for some reason, doing your physical therapy routine or cooking yourself a nice dinner or whatever. And the more we begin to develop that foundation of self-trust and self-respect internally, the more capable we become of advocating for our needs in other relationships because we've taught ourselves with ourselves that our needs matter.
Yeah. And something just from looking at your work and reading more about what you're writing about is that people pleasers tend to focus on things that they cannot control rather than what they can control. And I thought that was fascinating to learn about. And so I would love for you to elaborate on that and how that works as a people pleaser. Why people pleasers do that in the first place.
Yeah, it's such a frustrating pattern. And I think a lot of us don't even like realize we're doing it in the moment. But basically, because I'll try to break this down, like because so many of us struggle to value or meet or accommodate our own needs or wants, we rely on other people to do that for us, right? So we say, it's hard for me to honor my needs, but my partner should, or it's hard for me to tend to my own feelings, but they should really be mind reading what I feel. We struggle so much to do it ourselves, we rely on it from others. And this tends to lead to controlling patterns and behaviors. And this looks across the board. There are the classic people-pleasing ones, right, where we tend to try to control others' moods or feelings. We feel like we're responsible for being the happy sunshine present so that everyone around us is happy. We feel like that's in our domain, even though it's like really not. And in terms of other people's actions, we often feel like if we just make the request in the right way, if we just make a compelling enough case for why someone else should act a certain way, we really believe that they will change. And this can lead to some really frustrating cycles where we're actually trespassing other people's boundaries. Like, we're not seeing them at face value. We're not listening to what they say. We have our own agenda for how we hope to change their behavior. I'm kind of going off in a million different directions, but control comes in so hot in these conversations.
That is so powerful, because I think when you're a people pleaser, you don't consider yourself manipulating the environment or manipulating people's emotions, or I think you think you're being nice or you're coming at it in a polite way. But it's so fascinating to think about how your needs are unmet. So you are manipulating other people's feelings and actions.
But to you, it just looks like I'm just trying to help everyone else and put their needs before my own. But really, it is that form of manipulation, which is such just a mind F.
I love, though, that you've dug into this, though. I think that's so cool you've dug into this, because, you know, you're starting from where it stems from, that you're not taking care of yourself. Yes, you're taking care of everyone else. And yes, that's what it looks like. You do everything for everybody else. But then there's this resentment that has to come, right? If people aren't fulfilling, you know, you're giving and giving, and people aren't giving back the same because you're trying to manipulate them and it's not working. So is that where you see the resentment comes in when you're a people pleaser? Or, you know, how else have you seen that people kind of hold this resentment from trying to people please so much?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that, you're right. Like, resentment is kind of like the number one waving flag in the wind. Like, you're people pleasing, you know, need some boundaries. That's a big one, right? When we're trying to control other people's experience and it's not working, which, like, hate to spoil it, but it really doesn't work. So we're going to come up against that a lot. Another way the resentment can come in is from this transactional mindset that we talked about earlier. So a lot of us, it's the same thing, right? Like, I'll give to you, I'll try to mind read your needs. I'll put you first. I'll neglect my hobby so I can give you what you want. You know, we kind of engage in all of these, you could call them unhealthy behaviors. And then because we are overgiving, we expect those close to us to overgive in the same way, right? Like, I canceled all of my plans with friends so I could hang out with you all the time. So why aren't you canceling all of your plans with friends to hang out with me? And in this transactional mentality, we get super resentful without fully realizing that the real problem is that we neglected ourselves. And so now we're expecting other people to neglect themselves for us. And I always say, like, a relationship that depends on mutual self-sacrifice to be successful is not going to have a steady foundation, because the resentment that creeps into that, it's just going to be like this tar that glosses over everything.
I love thinking about that, and how we mindlessly do these things, though, right? It's like you can just get in this own cycle that you're unaware of. So the self-awareness is key. And something too that I read too within your content that really I feel like is powerful is thinking about your ability to handle discomfort. Other people's discomfort, your own discomfort. And so I just want to hear your take on that, because I just love everything that you have to say about it.
Oh my God. I was just thinking about this today, and I was even going to bring it up before, because I think one of the biggest reasons we engage in controlling behaviors is because we don't have distress tolerance skills for the most part. So think back, right? Just to play the movie through, start off as kiddos, whether it's because of trauma or having parents who couldn't mirror us in our emotions or whatever, we don't feel at home in ourselves, home being like our bodies and our hearts. A huge part of not being at home in ourselves is not being able to cope with distress. Like, when something feels off, when we're uncomfortable, we are so viscerally, like, unable to sit with and hold that emotion that we seek external soothing. You know, so this is where those controlling things come up. We can't do it ourselves. We expect other people to do it for us. And for that reason, learning how to cope with discomfort and distress is it's like the most foundational thing of breaking this pattern. That's both so that we can learn to rely on ourselves to self-soothe, meet our own needs, etc. And also so that when we start advocating for ourselves in our relationships through things like setting boundaries, we're able to kind of hold our ground. For example, like, what if someone doesn't like a boundary we've set? What if they push back against it? What if we try to share our vulnerable feelings and someone, like, slams the proverbial door in our face? we need to be able to have some sort of foundation of self-soothing so that we don't revert to all of those people-pleasing behaviors and take our boundary away and do whatever it takes to be okay again.
Or like fix the problem, right? Jumping in and fixing it because you're too uncomfortable to see that somebody else is uncomfortable.
Yes, it's like harmony at all costs. Like we will just run in and play fixer. Frankly, even if the problem has nothing to do with us. I'm sure so many of us has been there where like, maybe we're on the phone with our mom and our mom is telling us about a conflict she had with her friend, Bob. We're so uncomfortable being around other people's discomfort that instead of compassionately holding space and offering an empathetic ear, we so often will sort of play marionette and like try to reach into other people's problems and solve them just because we are so uncomfortable with discomfort.
So what do you recommend for your clients to do to start getting uncomfortable, to start breaking this pattern?
So I think a huge part of this is almost like an exposure therapy thing. It's exposing yourself incrementally to minor discomforts to prove to yourself that you are capable of it. So there's that element, right? So I often recommend like a ladder approach to self-advocacy. So like you're maybe not going to set the hardest boundary as the first boundary you set because your nervous system's just going to get fried and you're going to feel crappy. But what if you start from the bottom of the ladder? Like an example I often give is, what if you tell the barista at the cafe that you actually got the wrong order and you would like the right one, right? It's like low bar, like first rung of the ladder. Or what if you tell a friend that you can't actually volunteer at the food pantry next weekend because you're overwhelmed? So starting off with those smaller boundaries helps us incrementally increase our tolerance. But then even still, with those boundaries, we might feel uncomfortable. So it's important to have like self-soothing skills in our pocket, right? So things like, I mean, none of this is revolutionary. It's stuff you can read about on any article online, but like, you know, journaling it out, talking to a therapist, processing with a friend, somatically self-soothing, like going for a run, doing some deep breathing, distracting yourself even. So challenging yourself to push past your comfort zone, but then also having tools in your toolbox to soothe when stuff gets hard.
I love that approach of not overwhelming your nervous system, because clearly there's a reason you're people pleasing, and it's because you don't want that discomfort. Your nervous system is already jolted. And so to calmly show yourself, I got this. It isn't 0 to 100, but there are little things each day that you can do. You don't have to set that major boundary, but you could stick up for yourself a little bit and see how good it feels and tap into that feeling.
What's tricky though is boundaries don't always feel good, right? You know you need to set it, and then it's messy because it creates this ripple effect, right? Because people have been benefiting from you not having a boundary. And so, you know, everything you're talking about, it's like, it's creating new boundaries, right? And so can you just talk about that work and how people even get started with that discomfort once you've set it? Like, you know, you need to let your friend know when you're overwhelmed and you should say no, but how to start handling that backlash if someone is not happy with it, or even the feeling of knowing they're not going to be, or assuming they probably won't be. Like, how do you coach people to handle that?
I mean, that's one of the hardest parts of this work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, you know, because I think we've all been there. We go in anticipating a negative reaction, and then sometimes we're right. I'm not going to say all the time. People can really surprise us. But yeah, sometimes we set a boundary and it's everything from, there might be hurt, you know, they might just feel sad, which they're allowed to feel, right? When we ask someone for distance or space or time, they're allowed to be sad. So there's suffering with that. But then sometimes we experience active pushback where people are actively trying to disrespect the boundaries that we've set by, you know, doing the very thing we've asked them not to do, or gaslighting us, trying to manipulate us in some way. I encourage people to expect this. You know, I think it's so important to set realistic expectations for ourselves in boundary setting and kind of proactively coming up with a coping strategy. So, okay, they might not like this. What can we do? How can we have a plan going in if that's the case? And again, control. One of the biggest things is knowing what is not in our control, right? So we cannot control their reaction to our boundary. And when it's really strong and negative, we have to ask ourselves, am I willing to be privy to this reaction. What I mean by that is like, if I set a boundary with you and you start freaking out or getting really, really upset and angry, maybe I have the bandwidth to sit with you in those feelings and provide reassurance. Maybe I don't. Maybe that's a boundary I set for myself, is I have limited exposure after I set a boundary because I need to tend to my own needs and feelings in this moment. And that's okay. Like, we're ultimately not responsible for other people's reactions to our boundaries. Gosh, I think something else that really helps, this is more of a cognitive thing, but like, I really benefit from trying to channel a role model when I'm setting boundaries. Like, I think to myself, sometimes I encourage my clients, like, who's someone that you admire that's like really strong and self-respecting that you feel would be good at setting boundaries? And I've had people in my workshops say things like, I want to channel Beyonce, I want to channel Gandhi, or like whoever, Hermione Granger. I've had like every person you can imagine. And so in those moments, really just asking yourself, what would so-and-so do? And actually, it sounds silly, but it can be an incredibly powerful strategy to move through discomfort, because when we're just thinking about things like, if I'm in an interaction and I'm thinking, what would Hailey do? I have a certain window of options that feel possible to me based on myself. But if I think to myself, like, what would Beyonce do? All of a sudden, there's like 20 things I could do. And so having these little tricks to sort of summon resources outside of ourselves to resource ourselves really helps too.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you want a better answer, ask yourself better questions. You know deep down what you need. And sometimes it takes thinking outside the box, asking yourself a different question to get that. I love that approach.
It's something people fall into especially when they're new at boundaries, is justifying why they want to set it in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. And then they get into this rabbit hole, and then that gives the person you're setting a boundary with even more avenues to attack your boundary that you're setting, or, and so I know that justifying that and justifying, once you're trying to express your needs can be a tendency that people have. And so what would you say about that when you catch yourself kind of justifying your purchases or justifying your boundaries? Like, what kind of advice do you give to people in those situations?
Yeah, it's like highly contextual, because I think the level of justification you want to offer for a boundary tends to correspond to how intimate you are with someone. Because okay, hypothetical, right? Let's imagine me and my partner have been spending, 3 nights a week with each other for months and months. And then one day I wake up and I realize that's not working for me because I'm really busy right now. And so the next day I say to him, hey, babe, I love you, but we can't do sleepovers for the next 3 months. Sorry, I'm busy. That might come as a shock to him, right? Because it's such a shift from how things have been before. Am I entitled to that boundary? Of course, we're all entitled to our boundaries, but of course, like, our loved ones might have questions, they might have reactions. And so I think offering an explanation for our boundary in moments like that can actually be really beneficial and build intimacy, especially, and the key for that is often if we're changing a long established pattern in a relationship, it can be very helpful to offer an explanation, or even just have a conversation about, where's this coming from? Why? What are you feeling? It doesn't always need to be so cut and dry. I really think that this whole you don't need to justify your boundary advice is especially beneficial when someone is really reactive to our boundary and not, you can tell, right? When someone's coming at you from a super angry or disrespectful place, that's a huge sign that now is not the time to give your 5-point case for why this boundary is valid. It's about making sure that you're not setting yourself up for failure. I also encourage people to remember that, especially when there's not a lot of intimacy in a relationship, like if you say no to volunteering to coach the kickball team, you don't need to justify that at all, right? We all have limits and capacities. So you can't offer like a simple answer every time, but these are good things to be thinking about.
Yeah, depends on the boundary you're setting.
Yeah,
and the people you're setting it with.
Exactly.
So just to back up a bit, I kind of want to talk about how we know when it's time to set a boundary. Like, we probably know, but just some tips on like how you know that it's probably time to set one, and what to do with that, like fear, anxiety, panic that can come when you know it's time and you're going to have to like say something that could create some discomfort in a relationship.
Great question. And I think the first place to start would be, like you're saying, like, what are I call them like boundary setting signposts. What are the cues that signal to us that a boundary might be needed? And some of the heavy hitters are things like you named, right? Resentment as a big one, but also things like, anger, burnout, overwhelm. These can all be really helpful signs that a boundary's in order. Then there are some hidden signposts that are a little bit more complicated. But for example, things like avoidance or procrastination can be a great sign that we need to set a boundary, because the thing has become so charged somehow that we're not engaging with it anymore. So we need to figure out, like, is there something about this scenario that's making me want to avoid it or neglect it? And if so, can I set a boundary to make it more tenable for me? So anyway, those are some of the signposts, right? And each of us has different ones. I know for me, some of my like all-time most intense signposts are a feeling of resentment and a feeling of being like really small. Like when I'm in interactions, when I just feel like I'm shrinking into myself and like it's like I go from being full color to like monochrome. Something's happening in that's not working for me. So developing literacy with each of our biggest signposts is a great place to start. And then of course, right, so you're going into it, you're going to have this conversation and you're just feeling so panicked, right? It's like you're probably ruminating on all the ways you could go wrong. You're probably feeling those like somatic, like, racing heart, pounding head, whatever. So as with all things, I often recommend like a 3-pronged approach to moving through this discomfort. Cognitive, so doing stuff in your mind to make it better. Somatic, so doing stuff with your body to make it better. And then communal, so reaching out to other people to support you. And anytime you're feeling discomfort in this work, we can deploy all 3. So cognitive tools, so like ways we can shift our minds, is remembering, why is this so important to us? Not just in the short term, but in the long term, right? So yes, if you're about to have a conversation with someone with a boundary, the next 5 to 10 minutes might suck. We can just acknowledge that. But then give yourself permission to imagine what it'll be like a year from now after you've set this boundary, or 5 years. Once the immediate discomfort is over, you'll probably have an image of how this boundary will have really made your life better. So thinking long term, that's one example of a really great cognitive strategy. Somatically, like when we're stressed, we have all these like stress hormones flooding through our body. And sometimes physical activity is the only way to actually soothe that physical response. Things like I said before, right? Like going for a run, literally doing 10 seconds of really deep breathing, or even things like taking a nap to just reset. I'm a nap fan. Like I actually use them to reset like often, right? So body stuff. And then communal, like we're not meant to do this work alone. Like we get this narrative of individualism in our culture, but ultimately just reaching out to a friend and explaining to them, yo, I'm so nervous to talk to Sarah about this boundary. Can you talk me through it? Can be so helpful. So I recommend all 3 every time. One from each category can really help.
I love those examples. That's so powerful. Something that you can have immediately. You're going to set a boundary. It's going to be uncomfy. You know it. You're aware of it. And then what do I need to release to get that energy out of your body? Because it stays in your body and it's only going to perpetuate. It's only going to get worse.
Hailey, one of your quotes that I read, I thought was super powerful. You said, after a tough day of physical exercise, we interpret our soreness as a sign of a good workout. What if we reframed our post-boundary setting discomfort in the same way, as a sign that we just stretched our self-advocacy muscle to build long-term strength? I was like, damn, that's so perfect for Gold Ivy Health Co. Because we're always trying to, it's mind and body, right? And you really, if you think about that, like it's not super fun to pump some iron and be sore. But you build muscle, it helps your metabolism, it de-stresses you. It's just like that. And that helped me a lot to think about. It is so uncomfortable. I hate this feeling. I hate troubleshooting. I hate all the thoughts that I'm having. But yes, if I express this and I set this boundary, I don't have to think about it, or like it over time will get better. I'm going to thank myself for this like tough moment, just like I would if I was lifting some weights and a little sore.
Yes. I love that. It's a growing pain. It's literally
Mhm.
just a soreness that proves to you that you have just done a good, hard thing. You know, like this is what I encourage clients all the time when they're coping with guilt after setting a boundary. Instead of being like, this guilt is a sign that I did something bad, it's like, this guilt is a sign that I just did something unfamiliar and stood up for myself when I used to be silent. And it's so much more relieving to think of it in that way. And this is true also with boundaries with ourselves. Like I just made a post today about how it's kind of it's a little embarrassing, but whatever. So I got in an argument with my partner this weekend, just as couples do, and we were texting about it afterwards. And I sent a text or a voice memo, and he didn't respond for 5 hours. And that's fine because he's a busy person. But for me, those 5 hours were hell, you know, because and this is like my people, like I want there to be harmony. I want things to be reconciled right away. In the past, this is a great example of control. In the past, when there was such a delay, past me would have sent follow-up texts. I would have asked for reassurance. I would have basically tried to get him to act in a different way to soothe my distress instead of respecting his boundary, which was he was taking some time. And this, again, this was me sitting with the discomfort. Like I felt the energy moving through my body, but my boundary to myself was, I will not disrespect others' boundaries by compulsively asking for reassurance. And in that moment, I felt the stress, I felt the tension. And instead of seeing it as a sign that something was wrong, though, I was like, look at me building this distress tolerance muscle. Like, look at me exposing myself to this discomfort so that I can come out the other side. So these tools can apply not only with boundaries with other people, but also when we're doing the hard work of respecting our internal boundaries too.
Yeah, I keep thinking, I'm a mom of 3, and I keep thinking about that politeness and being kind. You want to teach your kids to be these kind, polite, follow the rules kids, right? But then also it's really important for them to learn to say no and to know who they are and respect themselves first. And I know that's something that you've talked about before too, is like the good girl, like, good job, you're being such a good girl, those types of things. I am so afraid of creating the good girl that can't speak up for themselves, or good boy, and I'm curious if that's played into your life at all, or with your clients, what you've seen with how they've been parented and how it kind of turns into some type of people-pleasing patterns.
Completely. And that's a big one. And that's a great example of an origin of people pleasing that actually doesn't involve trauma at all. It's like a reward system. So I was like, I'm an introvert. I'm like kind of, I wasn't the loud kid running around screaming, which maybe I could have been, it might've been better for me, but I was the more mellow kid. And I got a lot of praise for that, right? Because I was the good girl. I was the one who got the good grades, followed the more traditional pathway of success. And we learn from that. Every time we get positive affirmation for a way we're acting, we basically internalize the lesson that, like, oh, this is how I get loved. This is how I'm seen. And it's incredible. I mean, frankly, the clients I work with are awesome people because they've been taught through experience that they're great listeners, they're empathetic, they're there for you in a pinch, right? Like these are kind of like the people pleaser superpowers, which isn't intrinsically a bad thing. But the problem is when those behaviors limit us from being our authentic selves. We're so stuck on being the good girl or the good listener or the good friend that the other parts of us get stifled. It's incredible. I don't know if you have experienced this, both of you, but even just this phenomenon of feeling like you're so good at being a social chameleon, like you're so good at becoming who everyone else wants you to be. I used to think I was so cool because of that. I could walk into any room and start a conversation with someone, and because of my people pleasing and my hypervigilance, I could become who I thought they wanted me to be. And for a while, it felt like a superpower until I realized that, is it really power if I'm just being what everyone else wants? That's actually a cage. It's a prison,
I feel like ultimately too, you're so disconnected from yourself if you're able to do that. If you don't have that disconnect of like, whoa, that felt really inauthentic of me, and we can go a whole lifetime doing that. We can go a whole lifetime just catering to what everybody else. And I can totally relate to this. I love walking in a room and being liked. Who doesn't, right? But yeah, I've noticed that more and more, that the more I'm connected to myself and my values and what brings me energy and what I feel connected to, the more that I do that, everything else is better. There's less resentment. There's less frustration. I'm in a better mood. I sleep better. Thoughts are more clear. It's powerful stuff when you're connecting more to who you authentically are.
Yeah, totally agree. It's so powerful when you go from being that, like, I can put on any facade person. I still remember a couple specific instances where in a moment I was so uncomfortable. Past me would have been able to skate through the discomfort and just people please. Present me, the discomfort built up to such a point where I couldn't not say something. And that felt like a victory. I mean, I was like, wow, I've become more aligned with myself where I can't not advocate for myself in a moment of distress. And oh my God, just talking about it, I remember I almost cried at it because I was so grateful to become aligned that way. And I see this with my clients a lot, and it's such an incredible, an incredible moment of homecoming.
Oh, that's
well,
so beautiful.
yeah, and it's an example for everybody else. Like, I love when someone stands up. Like, even this weekend, one of my friends was like, I didn't like that sermon. That did not sit well with me. I didn't like this about it and this about it. I'm like, wow, she could have just skated by and been like, just agreed with everything. But I think you respect people more when they can think, when they can analyze the situation for themselves, what's true to them, and then express themselves. It's like, it can set us all free. And so that's what I'm hoping to do as a parent is I want you to first think about what's going on in your mind, what you don't agree with, what you do agree with, right? That's the funnel we're going to be looking through, we're going to be using to figure out who we want as a friend or what decisions we're making, right? And that's most important rather than any validation that anybody can give you, whether it's cool or not, or if you're the good girl, you're doing a good job. How did that feel in your body? Did that feel right? Was your gut off at all? Those types of things. I'm really trying to influence my kids to do that. So if you have any tips for me on how to encourage children to do that, because I don't know what I'm doing.
And we have a lot of moms listening.
Yeah.
So I'm sure a lot of people would value hearing.
Oh my God. Well, you're doing it. I think okay, so first of all, disclaimer, I'm not a parent. So when people ask me about boundaries with their kids, I feel like I have to say that because I could never lived experience get what you're going through. But role modeling, before we talked about channeling a role model to set boundaries, I think another great skill is remembering that we are role modeling boundaries for those around us. I know for a fact that I internalize probably 80% of my mom's behaviors and interpersonal patterns. And so I think that, of course, explicitly saying to your kiddos to look within themselves, validate their own emotions, have their own almost rubric for assessing situations is wonderful. But then also for parents listening, your behavior and how you model these behaviors is honestly, again, I don't know, I'm not a parent. It's probably even more important because that's how we learn. For so many of the clients I've worked with are parents, and especially mothers. And it's been so beautiful to hear them say, when I ask them, why are you doing this? Why do you care about setting boundaries? They say, I want to break these overgiving patterns now so that my kids can grow up feeling like they can say no and be themselves. And it is one of the most motivating reasons a person could have for this work. And kids do learn through that.
Yeah, they learn by what you do more than what you say, because you can tell them you need to say no, but if they see you constantly saying yes when you want to say no.
Yeah, I always think about what Ed Milet said, where things are caught, not taught, because it's so true. You see your parent acting, and that's your model. Of course you're going to act like that. That's what you have in the home. That's what you see. You're constantly with them.
Yeah.
How are you setting boundaries? How are you modeling for your kids?
Well, I had a good model. My mom was really good at setting boundaries and being like, no, I don't like that. No, it's not okay with me. Sometimes it would make me uncomfortable. I'd be like, can we people please a little more around here? No, it was great though. I learned I just like, it's kind of like you just don't take shit from people, right? Like the way that she modeled boundaries for me made me realize like I need to have these high standards because she had great friendships, right? Like she would expect a lot from her friendships. And I think she expected a lot of herself, right? And modeled great friendships for me. And I feel like anytime I feel like someone is being shitty to me, it's like I've got this really high alert system that's like, well, I do not want that near me. And so how I'm modeling, like the other day I was modeling this for my daughter where she was talking with a friend and it wasn't going well. They were on like a messenger thing. And I just said, why don't you just step away? Like if neither of you can come to some type of like friendly agreement and how this should go, like just take a step away for a second, you know? So it's just like little things like that. But
win. I'm over here like, yeah. That is so huge. And that's also, I love that advice too, because it's a great example of like, okay, can't control your friend, but you can control to what extent you participate in this conversation. It's a good one.
Yeah, well, and having them have their own opinions and values and being able to voice those productively. You know, going back to what you said, the difference between kind and people pleasing, I think you can be your own authentic self. You can stick up for your needs, even though we meet them ourselves, but you know, what you expect of others and what you will put up with, but you can do it in a kind way.
That's what I need to work on because I'll be like, I am out of here. Like, absolutely not. Bye. You know, where I could be like, hey, you know, that's actually not okay with me. Or, you know, I could definitely work on the weaving in some more kindness. When
well, it's almost more uncomfortable to do it kindly versus just like dipping out because that's like a fear mechanism, I feel like, or a protective mechanism of this is uncomfortable for me to even say something. So I'm just going to avoid.
And that's like a really cool segue into this phenomenon that I've seen a lot is that so many people pleasing types actually have a really extensive history of like ghosting, whether that's ghosting in dating, ghosting on friends, for that very reason. Because having the hard talk is so viscerally uncomfortable and we work ourselves into such a state. So we don't communicate our needs or say what made us uncomfortable or whatever. And so ultimately it's an avoidance strategy. We just ghost because we feel like we have two choices: ghost or have a conversation that feels impossible for us to have. And so it's really interesting because when we think about boundaries, you know, we tend to focus on all the hard parts, like I'm going to hurt someone, I'm going to disappoint them, I need to move through the discomfort. It's like, okay, yes. And like learning how to do this helps us be kinder, actually. Like it's kinder to tell someone, hey, I'm just not interested, sorry, than to just like ghost or peace out. So there's like this hidden like other side to the boundary coin that's actually really beautiful and life affirming too.
Yeah. I think it's tough when it's someone you've had a relationship with for a really long time, starting to have those conversations. And I'm almost visualizing the latter approach that you said, Hailey, of like starting to set smaller boundaries. Like, is that a thing?
Like in existing relationships that like working your way up. Yeah.
Yeah. Like almost getting clear on what boundaries you need to set. I think when you're so activated in a relationship that you are kind of forced to be in, whether it be family or friends of family, or, you know, they're going to be in your life of what is triggering me and starting to get self-aware. This is me verbally processing.
No, I mean, it's such a great point because those are the hardest. I mean, look, boundaries with family, like personally, like I have a family member who I love, who always makes comments about people's bodies. And I come from a history of body image issues. So many, I mean, pretty much every woman in my family does because the stuff is generational. And I remember like this has been one of my biggest boundary foils because so many times with this person, I tried everything. Like I did the approach like, you know, crying and just saying, hey, it like really affects me when you make these comments. Could you not? Making the approach of like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe you say this stuff. It's so unethical. Like I tried everything in my box to try to get this person to not do this behavior that at least to me seems objectively harmful. And in those cases, it's so frustrating because it's like everyone agrees that what you're doing is a problem. But what's been so interesting in this journey is just realizing that like fair or what's right kind of has nothing to do with it. If they're going to participate in this behavior and none of your attempts to influence it are working, that's where the really hard family boundaries come in, where it's like, I can't change them. Literally, all I can do is decide. I often use this phrase, like, to what extent am I willing to be close and connected to someone who engages in this behavior? And sometimes that looks like everything from cutting off the relationship entirely, which is kind of like a really intense option, to like spending less time, not picking up the phone as often, like literally leaving the physical space in which the person is doing the thing. Yeah, it's painful. It comes with grief because we're like, I just want them to change. If they would only just change, then we could be fine. And it's like, oh, I have to grieve that they're not going to change, and then grieve that we might need to be a little more distant. That was kind of a long tangent, but I thought of it when you were talking about like family boundaries.
That's super helpful. It's that acceptance, right? If they can't accept the boundary, what am I willing to accept as far as time, connection, or grieving the relationship?
Totally. And I think too, what I just keep thinking about is these boundaries, ultimately, if this person is going to be in your life, it's going to make your relationship stronger. If someone loves you and cares about you and they want a relationship with you, they want to know how you feel, truly. They don't want you to just cater to their needs. They want you to be you, feeling safe, feeling seen, feeling like it's this mutual beneficial relationship. And if it's not that, then of course, cut down the time. Like, why be around people that don't truly care about how you're doing? And if something's wrong, they'd want to understand and see if there's some type of middle ground.
Yeah, those are the safe relationships, what we really want, you know? And it can be really painful to come to terms with the fact that, like, I think we talked a lot about control. Like, I think we have to talk about the grief part, because sometimes what ends up happening, like, is that we know that if we reach the point of setting a boundary, if we truly accept that they're not going to change, we're going to need to create some distance. That is really, really sad. It's grief. It's pain. So many of us are like unwilling to face that grief or pain that we almost like keep ourselves trapped in what I call the cycle of endless requests. So we're like, okay, I'm sure if I ask them the 32nd time, like, this is it. Like, this is when they'll change. And I think we stay stuck in that cycle going around and around when nothing changes, because the truth is we don't want to face like the very real and valid grief that arises otherwise. Grief is like such a huge part of boundary work.
I love that you said that, because it is a part of relationships. Sometimes you have to say goodbye to them. And, you know, I think any therapist would say that sometimes it's short term and sometimes it's long term, but sometimes it's just needed. And then you can circle back and it can become something else. You know, it can be a lot of different things. And I'm just so happy you're doing this work, because I think you're really helping, especially women, connect to themselves and what they want and how they feel. You're helping women parent better and have richer relationships. And, you know, you talked a bit about, you know, shape-shifting in intimate relationships with a partner. And I mean, life is about relationships. It's about this richness that we can have. And the more authentic we are, I just feel like it can just get better and better the more that we follow Hailey and keep getting tips, because every time you post, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's just gold. I love it.
Well, and not only is it your social media, but it's these workshops that you offer. Yeah. So I'd love for you to speak and share with our listeners what these workshops are.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the workshops are so fun because it's this virtual room of people who, like, just like us, they get it, you know, they're in it. So I offer like one workshop a month. I've got these 7 that I do on rotation, and they're also available, just you can download them on my website. And we cover everything from just like basic setting boundaries. We have ones for emotional boundaries, so how to stop trying to like onboard other people's emotions and fix them. We have one for coping with the process of, like we just talked about, like outgrowing relationships and how that works. So really, they're designed to walk you through the process and just give you so many like strategies and tools. And then for folks who are ready to level up and they're like, all right, it's time for boundaries, I'm ready to commit to this, I also offer a 6-week boundary setting program. It's called the Say No Club, for folks who are really ready to just learn how to practice that muscle of saying no so they can simultaneously say yes to themselves.
Ugh, I love it. And like you said earlier, we weren't meant to do this alone. Someone is offering a roadmap of how to end your pain and help with the suffering. So highly, highly recommend you check out Hailey's work, her workshops, her Instagram, and all of her socials. Where can they find you on social media?
Instagram's probably the hottest place these days. It's at Hailey Magee, but then you can also find me under the same name, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and beyond.
Awesome. And we'll plug all of that in our show notes too. Wonderful. So next, Hailey, we do something called the 3 gold stars, 3 small steps for our listeners.
Identify your boundary setting signposts. Become familiar with what are the red flags that say, hey, I need a boundary. So remember, we talked about them being like resentment, overwhelm, burnout, ghosting. Just begin to notice and develop those. That's the first one. Okay. Second one would probably be consider what your boundary ladder might be, right? So if the very top rung of the ladder is, ending a toxic relationship with your Uncle Jeff, work your way down. What might the very first rung of the boundary look? Do you want to correct the barista when they give you the wrong order? Do you want to correct someone when they mispronounce your name? And maybe make a commitment to yourself to set one of those lowest tier boundaries this week, just to strengthen the muscle. And then finally, for the third step, I would say, come up with a list of like 3 to 5 actions you can take to self-soothe when the discomfort of boundary setting and self-advocacy kind of comes on loud. Remember, those steps could be cognitive, so reframing your guilt and discomfort. They could be somatic, so doing something with your body. And then also something communal, making sure you're reaching out to a friend or, doing something in community. So there's your homework. 3 steps.
I love it. Those are all
so good.
So good. All right, Hailey, Unleashing Ivy. This is our rapid fire surprise questions. Are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. This question we haven't talked about, or this topic, I should say, and it has sparked some curiosity with me because I am 36 days sober, no alcohol, and we know you are 4 years sober. So what inspired you to be sober, and what has been your greatest lesson so far?
Well, first, I'm so stoked on you. Happy 36 days. That's seriously, the first months are by far the hardest. So I'm truly celebrating you. And I've been sober now. Yeah, I just hit, 4 years? And I quit drinking because I reached a point where I was no longer keeping my promises to myself about not drinking. So in college, I had a year or two where I was really drinking heavily and blacking out, having hangovers. That had dulled down a bit, but by the time I quit, I really stopped because in the morning I would say, all right, I'm going on a date tonight, but I'm not going to drink. I promise. And then I'd have even just 2 glasses of wine, which for the average person is no biggie. But for me, the feeling that I was constantly not able to trust myself around drinking was the worst part. It created so much anxiety in me and so much stress. And so ultimately, I just felt like my life would be better without it. So it's been a journey though. And it's changed my life for the better. I trust myself so much more now. I never feel hungover, and I genuinely, I never even think about drinking, literally ever. It's wonderful. So keep going. If you're listening, or for you, truly, it's huge.
It is that feeling of not being hungover. Having, twice of a weekend, I feel like it's something they don't talk about. Not having to be in bed or hungover. I'm like, this is what a weekend should be like.
Oh my God, right? I never even used to schedule anything on weekends before 3 p.m. because I was I don't know what state I'll be in. So for sure.
I love that. Well, congratulations to you. That is huge. 4 years.
Thank you.
All right. My question has to do with inner freedom. You kind of talk about inner freedom, and I'm just curious what that means for you in this season of your life.
To me, what inner freedom means is that I trust myself to make the choices that are right for me. I feel like I have my own back, which is what inner freedom means to me, because I don't think I felt that in the past. I felt I had some semblance of having my own back, but if someone came around or something came around, I just felt like they could just knock me right over and I wouldn't be able to stand up for myself or have myself. So right now, what that means is I don't know, I'm going through a lot of shifts at work. Things are growing and changing, and I'm really just trying to listen inward and do what is best for me, not what like society would prescribe for me, not what the traditional growth ladder would look like for a business owner or someone on social media. Like, I'm really trying to listen in and be like, what do I need to do? So it feels good. Like, it feels really good to trust myself. That's kind of a convoluted answer, but it's what came to mind.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's what everybody wants, right? Is to have the guts to not try and meet everybody else's expectations of your life and just do what you want and follow your dreams.
Which I feel like is hard as an entrepreneur, right? Because you're looking to all these people for advice and how they did it, and it's just being projected on you that I think sometimes you're like, what do I even want? What feels right for me? Let me not take all of the advice, but actually listen to the advice for myself.
It's really wild as an entrepreneur and someone with like a big social media following, because it's kind of like you feel this pressure and you're told by you want to be growing all the time and like getting more likes and follows, and like it, on the one hand, of course I'm grateful, but on the other hand, it can kind of feel like golden handcuffs, because you feel like you're on this single track and you're required to teach people and help people. But sometimes I feel like I don't have the answers. You know, sometimes I feel like the student, I want a teacher. So it's really interesting to, I don't know, reconcile all those different forces. It's a challenge.
Well, thank you for your honesty. I think that just speaks that people that are big on social media, have a big presence, they're still figuring it out. They're still learning to trust themselves and figure out what they want. So I think having that vulnerability is important to hear. So thank you. All right. And last question, Hailey, if you could go back and tell younger Hailey one thing, what would you tell her?
I think what I would tell her is that like negative emotions are not things that need to be fixed. I think that's been a big source of stress for me throughout my life, is I'm so focused on like self-help and personal growth and therapy. And so I often move into trying to find solutions for my pain instead of letting myself just move through my pain and trusting that, just like a wave in the ocean, like it will come and go. And I think I could have saved myself a lot of stress. So that's probably what I'd tell her.
That's beautiful. And I mean, you're helping her, right? Your work is helping the person that you once were, right? And you're making this progress, but it's beautiful that you're helping all those people that are that same little girl. You're setting them free, right? You're giving them examples and stories and tips and ideas for how to allow those feelings to come. You have these nuance parties, you call them, where it's like two things can be true, right? You can be healing and have negative emotion, right? You can set a boundary and you can have love for the person you're setting the boundary with. Like, your work is so beautiful that it's really just this life experience and kind of putting these terms and steps and reflections in place for people just to have an idea of how to even do this. And so I just want to thank you for the freedom that you're giving everybody, and the words that you're a writer, you're a beautiful writer, that it's so nice to have someone put it in words that we can all understand and then apply it to our life. So thank you so much.
That means a lot to me. I'm very moved by that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And when you write a book, let us know. We'll have you back on. We'll be your biggest hype girls, because like Andrea said, your writing is beautiful. So everyone, go follow Hailey, look into her work, help yourself out, and give yourself just a pat on the back for listening to this episode, for doing the hard work to heal. This isn't fancy, juicy, sexy stuff, but it is life-changing stuff. And so be proud of yourself. I just want to say that.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Hailey, because you're so great with words, our last segment of our show is always sharing a piece of gold, a quote that speaks to you.
Okay, so what came to mind is actually an Elizabeth Gilbert quote, very apropos to our conversation today, but I think the exact language is, "You're afraid to surrender control, but you never had control. All you had was anxiety." And I really just love that, because she's right.
This is Gold Ivy signing off. Listen to your truth and go chase your gold.